You're finally here. You finally arrived. You've at last found the one place which holds the answers to the questions of the ages. You're excited. Your heart palpitates. Is it real? Can it be true? You're understandably hesitant, yet determinedly hopeful. That is good. Your faith in such matters will be rewarded. You'll not find pat and cliched answers here. No! Here is a place of clarity, of definition, of explanation, of truth. Here combines science and religion, removes tradition and replaces it with fact. Here the universe is holographic, yet tangible, ethereal, yet substantive. Here is a place where time is understood as atemporal. Here there is harmony amidst chaos. Here is where the darkened glass is finally cleared. Here is where you'll find the answers to all the unanswered questions which stretch across the cosmos.
And you are across the cosmos for the next hour. I am Chase Rockwell, and I am your host. I am joined once again in studio by my co-hosts,
David Cameron,
Mark Wilson,
Wally Rogers,
and Lou Rogers.
And Wally is a guest today in our studio, and we welcome him. So we're going to get into the subject today. It is going to be a different show. We typically choose topics which we as your humble host are impassioned about. As the thought goes, if we're impassioned about a topic, then we hope to convey that passion to you as a listener. I feel no less about this topic today, which is the death penalty. I've been a Christian for most of my life. In fact, there wasn't a time when I can't remember not regarding myself as a believer, and I know that most of the hosts with me today are in the same situation. We're all longtime believers in Christ. My personal story as growing up in a Christian household can have its own peculiarities, especially if one's parents are still searching for the truth themselves. There are bound to be missteps and travels down pathways which may not be good for a Christ-centered relationship. My parents, specifically my mother, were orthodox in their religious thought and belief. They were convinced that there would be a time when Christ would return, he would rapture his church, and then this tribulation would begin. Things after that would get much, much worse for those who were left behind. They believed in obedience to the Old Testament Law, that I didn't exactly see it that way. The law and Christ were all one and the same as taught by their church. In that, they were typical of most born-again Christians. I raise this point for only one reason. As Christians, we are no longer bound by the law. That covenant was fulfilled and has been nullified by Jesus Christ. As Christians, we are now called to a higher standard. That standard is to be the face of Christ to one another. This higher standard requires us to be far more mature in faith, far more in tune with just who Christ is and who we are in Christ. This is a concept sadly lost on today's church for a host of reasons, but largely rooted in the refusal to acknowledge Christ's work upon the cross. That very fact is the reason I raise this topic today on Across the Cosmos. If believers were mature in their faith, if they understood the heart of Christ and endeavored to accurately reflect his face to one another, today's podcast would be necessary only to those who do not claim Christ. Sadly, this is not the case. Now let me explain. Perhaps the most famous execution in the history of the entire world is that of Jesus Christ. Here was a man who committed no crime, a fact buttressed by the Judean provincial governor of the time, Pontius Pilate's washing of his hands of the situation. Yet, Christ was executed by the state anyway. We as Christians now look upon Christ's execution as something which was necessary for our sake, but unfortunate in any event. Even those who are not believers are aware that based upon the Scriptures, Christ did not deserve to be executed. Christ was a victim of his day, and his ideas placed him at odds with those who had much to lose should he be allowed to live. Today in the United States of America, we find ourselves mired in the exact same situation. And what do I mean by that? Let me elaborate. In February of 2014, newly elected Washington State Governor Jay Inslee issued a moratorium on capital punishment, saying, quote, "There are too many doubts and too many flaws raised by its application." Inslee concluded that the death penalty was inconsistently applied. He further stated, quote, "Equal justice under the law is the state's primary responsibility, and in death penalty cases I'm not convinced that equal justice is being served." Inslee's moratorium on capital punishment follows the lead of many other governors throughout the country. In 2013, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper issued a like moratorium for the same reasons as highlighted by Jay Inslee, as did Oregon's Governor John Kitzhaber in 2011. However, the most noted of this rash of issued moratoriums rests was Illinois' governor, George Ryan, in 2000. George Ryan stood apart from his colleagues not only by the fact that the four governors mentioned he was the only Republican, the other three all being from the Democratic Party. What made Ryan stand apart from these Democratic governors who had similarly issued moratoriums in their states was that George Ryan was also the only one who truly held a pro-life position. Now, why do I say that? Well, the record speaks for itself. George Ryan not only issued a moratorium on capital punishment in Illinois, but he also holds that abortion is murder. In other words, he holds a true pro-life view. Pro-life is pro-life, period. The aforementioned Democratic governors are all pro-abortion. Ergo, they're not truly pro-life, but rather anti-death penalty. Their moral base for rejecting the death penalty is therefore nullified by their stand on abortion, irrespective of the legal argument. Why is the United States still executing people in the 21st century? Do we as a people truly believe that retributive justice is actually just? Have we come no further than the Old Testament law as outlined in Exodus chapter 22, verses 23 and 24, which reads, "But if there is serious injury, you are to take life for life, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, and bruise for bruise." Getting back to the most famous execution victim in history for a moment, it is of note that his thoughts on this type of retributive justice is very clear. To wit, quote, "You have heard it said, eye for eye and tooth for tooth, but I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also." You could find that in Matthew chapter 8, verses 38 and 39. Christ also had occasion to deal with a victim of imminent execution and was able to cut through the weak rationale of the executioners in his famous passage. Quote, "At dawn he appeared again at the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teachers of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, 'Teacher, this woman was caught up in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?' They were using this question as a trap in order to have the basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started to write in the ground with his finger. When they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, 'Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her.' Again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the older ones first, until only Jesus was left, with the woman still standing there. Jesus straightened up and asked her, 'Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?' 'No one, sir,' she said. 'Then neither do I condemn you,' Jesus declared. 'Go now and leave your life of sin.'" That was found in John 8, 1 through 11. In 2015, the United States is the only G7 country to still execute its people. The G7, or Group of Seven, is an informal bloc of industrialized democracies, which include France, Germany, Italy, the United Kingdom, Japan, the United States, and Canada. Of the superpowers, China still executes its citizens, whereas Russia outlawed capital punishment in 1999. Of interest is the fact that the Palestinian Authority still executes its citizens, but Israel has banned such practice since 1954, except in extreme cases. The execution of Nazi Adolf Eichmann in June of 1962 was one such exception. But why should we care about anyone being executed? If a person has stood trial, enjoyed appeals, and is still found guilty, what do we care if they are executed? A life for a life, after all. It is in the good book, correct? Well, it is, and as I've already mentioned, Christ wasn't a fan. From a legal point of view, for a moment, it is well established that while we are supposed to enjoy equal justice under the law, we do not. I will cite two cases in order to illustrate my point. On February 21st of 2005, Wichita, Kansas police stopped a car driven by the 60-year-old president of the Christ Lutheran Church Council and a Cub Scout leader, Dennis Rader. He was taken into custody and subsequently charged with being the infamous BTK killer. BTK stands for Bind, Torture, and Kill. Between the years of 1974 and 1991, Rader murdered 10 people, beginning with the Otero family who lived nearby. Now, what he did to the Otero's 11-year-old daughter as he killed her, I'll leave to the curious to look up on their own. Despite confessing to the murders and alluding to having committed even more, the authorities had not yet tied to him. Rader would not suffer the death penalty. The state of Kansas had not reinstated the death penalty until 1994, 3 years after his last murder. The United States Supreme Court had ruled the death penalty was unconstitutional in 1972. This was later modified and the moratorium was lifted in 1976. Rader was instead given 10 consecutive life terms and must serve at least 175 years before he is eligible for parole. Rader is not alone. Other infamous serial killers who avoided the ultimate punishment are Jeffrey Dahmer, who murdered 17 men and boys between 1978 and 1991. Gary Ridgway, the infamous I-5 killer, who murdered 49 women and girls over a 2-decade spree. Wayne Williams, who murdered between 23 and 29 men and boys between 1979 and 1982 in Atlanta, Georgia. And, of course, the Manson family, headed by Charles Manson. That clan was responsible for the deaths of 9 people in the summer of 1969. Now, while they were originally sentenced to death, the aforementioned Supreme Court decision saw their sentences commuted to life in prison with the possibility of parole, which they have all been eligible since 1978. Now, contrast those cases with the case of Karla Faye Tucker. On February 3rd, 1998, at 6:37 p.m., Tucker, who was already strapped into a gurney in the death chamber of Huntsville Correctional Facility in Texas, began to receive a fatal dose of a cocktail of drugs through an intravenous tube in her arms. 8 minutes later, those drugs had rendered her unconscious, then paralyzed her muscles and stopped her heart. She was 38 years old. Tucker was a 23-year-old prostitute and drug abuser when she, along with her boyfriend Danny Garrett, broke into a friend's apartment with the intention of stealing a motorcycle in June of 1983. While in the apartment, they decided to rob their friend, Jerry Dean, of any additional motorcycle parts they could find. Dean defended himself from Garrett's attack. Tucker helped Garrett in subduing and eventually killing Dean with a pickaxe. It wasn't until after Dean was dead and Garrett began loading the motorcycle parts into Dean's car that Tucker noticed a woman cowering in the corner of the room. The woman, Deborah Thornton, had only met Jerry Dean at a party that very afternoon. Tucker attacked Thornton and eventually killed her by striking her repeatedly with the same pickaxe she'd used to kill Dean. Dean and Thornton's bodies were discovered the next morning by a co-worker of Dean's. Both Garrett and Tucker were soon caught and indicted for first-degree murder in September of 1983. Both were subsequently sentenced to death at the conclusion of a trial in late 1984. I highlight Tucker's case for a couple of reasons. Though Texas hardly ever sentenced a woman to death in capital crimes, Tucker was one of the few exceptions. While on death row, she shared a cell with a woman named Pam Perillo, whose own death sentence was later commuted to life in prison through an appeals process. Additionally, by the time of her execution, Tucker had become a born-again Christian and had turned her life around. She had never denied her part in the murders and repeatedly expressed remorse for the killings and her behavior. I will note that Tucker's life was never an easy one. Her parents divorced when she was 10. By the age of 12, she was a drug addict and sleeping with men. By 14, she had drifted into prostitution and took to following her mother around as a groupie for the Allman Brothers Band, the Marshall Tucker Band, and the Eagles. Despite everyone from the prison warden to Pope John Paul II begging for a commutation of her sentence to that of life imprisonment, then Texas Governor George W. Bush refused, saying, quote, "The Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles refused her clemency plea, and I'm not going to interfere with their decision." Talk show host Tucker Carlson alleged that Bush, who was alluding to a television interview which Karla Faye Tucker had given on a talk show host with Larry King, smirked and spoke mockingly about her when he interviewed the governor. Your humble host remembers with clarity that moment, and for me it was a defining time. I knew then that George W. Bush was a man lacking any vestige of character. Here was a man who had refused to grant pardon to someone he knew to be of no threat to anyone, a woman who had dedicated her life to Christ and atoning for her transgressions, and then he turned his back on her for the sake of political expediency. It should be of note that George W. Bush was caught drunk driving back in the mid-1970s and later confessed to being an alcoholic. His wife Laura threatened to leave him if he didn't sober up. It was through that threat that Bush says he turned his life over to Christ and became a born-again Christian. Given the grace he received, I have to wonder how a man could have just as easily killed another while he was driving drunk himself, could then turn his back on a fellow Christian. Of course, in the case of Bush, I already know the answer. He was planning on running for the presidency, and he needed to pander to the tough-on-crime Christian evangelicals whose motto ought to be, "We love and forgive you, but you still gotta pay." The legal aspect is clear. There is no equal justice under the law in the United States. Karla Faye Tucker was of no more use to the district attorney as she'd confessed to a clear-cut crime. In the cases of Rader, Ridgway, Williams, there was a need to, quote, make a deal in order to find more bodies. The lesson learned is this. If you're going to murder someone in the United States in 2015, you need to do one of three things. Pay pay a lot of money to a high-priced attorney, as O.J. Simpson did, find a state that does not have the death penalty, or kill a whole lot of people. To be certain, there are bad people who no one will shed tears over if they face the death penalty. One such person is Richard Allen Davis. Davis, with already a lengthy criminal history behind him making him eligible for California's three strikes law, raped and murdered 12-year-old Polly Klaas in Petaluma, California in October of 1993. He disposed of her body in a field under a sheet of plywood and garbage. At his sentencing, Davis read a statement claiming that Polly had said to Davis, "Just don't do me like my dad," just before Davis killed her, implying that Klaas' father was a child molester. Judge Thomas C. Hastings proceeded with the formality of the death sentence, saying, "Mr. Davis, this is always a traumatic and emotional decision for any judge. You just made it very easy for me today by your conduct." While Davis was sentenced to death, he is still very much alive, 19 years after his conviction, and almost 22 years after the actual murder. As a point of fact, the average time spent on death row, according to 2010 figures, is 178 months, or just a little under 14 years. The longest time for any condemned man on death row was the case of Gary Alvord, who spent more than 40 years on death row in Florida before dying of natural causes. Okay, I have much more to say about this, but I want opinions.
Well, for myself, I am firmly against the death penalty for several reasons. One, I take the view life is life, and I don't have the right to end that life.
So Richard Allen Davis, a scum. I mean, the
Very
man is
much so.
absolute scum.
Yes, he is. And he needs to be locked away and the key tossed away, and so you're not getting out for the rest of your natural life.
So in what man... Let's cut to the chase here. I want to take care of the legal aspect of this first, because that's certainly part of what's going to come up. And the legal aspect of it is that the death penalty certainly deters recidivism.
It does.
If you're dead, you're not going to be killing too many more people.
Well, I agree. There is the mentality of you are not fit for society, so we're just going to remove you completely.
But from a legal aspect, does the death penalty have any... Does the death penalty have any logic or reason behind it? If we, for example, Richard Allen Davis, I get them mixed up. There's so many.
Yes.
Killed Polly Klaas in 1993. He was caught very soon after. I mean,
yeah, it was. I remember the case.
A stumble bum, and he didn't really hide his tracks very well. So he's been in prison for 22. It's about 22 years. Death row since 96 when he was convicted. He's been out of society that whole time. He hasn't killed not even anyone in prison.
Right.
Effectively, he's been removed.
Well, death row in prison, you're basically in isolation all the time.
For some, in the case of Carla Faye Tucker, because she had done so much to turn her life around, she was not only in the general prison population, but she led various women's groups and counseling sessions. The warden essentially gave her free rein. She had more, if you want to call it, freedom behind bars than a lot of the other inmates on lesser charges. It wasn't until she was rounding up to the time of her actual execution, like within the last month or something, that they moved her into isolation.
Right.
And there was tremendous amount of resistance on the part of the prison staff to do so. They didn't see any point in it. And that's why my blood boiled over the whole situation, because George W. Bush, very well within his rights as governor, to commute that sentence citing these extenuating circumstances. And God have mercy on the man, is all I can say. Just God have mercy on him, because the man murdered Carla Faye Tucker as much as Carla Faye Tucker murdered Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton, in my opinion. And I realize most people will disagree with me on that. I don't care. We're still in the United States of America. It's still my opinion. So, the legal aspect is we can remove people.
Yes, we can.
From society. We can make sure that they aren't going to commit murders again. Do we have to kill them?
I say no, we don't.
So why do we?
I say it's human nature seeking revenge.
So retributive justice.
I believe so.
Well, and I think there's a lack of understanding of what are we here for? Why are we alive? What's life about? Who are we? I think it really goes back to some of the things we always talk about. And, when people don't realize, first of all, that Christ fulfilled the law, not that the law goes away totally, but right and wrong is always there. And there are consequences in life. You do things. Businesses, governments, things have to be run with rules. That's just the way it is.
I completely understand that.
But I agree, the protection of the public is important. You have someone that has demonstrated their willingness or whatever, their sickness or whatever it is to kill people. Yeah, the public needs to be protected. If we understood more about why we are alive and who we are, I believe we would be more like Jesus and have more grace and mercy, in that He fulfilled the law. What does the Word tell us about the law? That it produces no righteousness, no right standing, or let me clarify that in my belief, it produces no relationship with God. Okay?
I agree.
But,
does not.
But those that claim to have a relationship with God are the first ones to say, let me push the damn button and kill this bastard.
They don't understand. You and I know they don't totally understand. The question goes back.
Or maybe they do understand, but they just consider that since this person's committed such a grievous crime, that they're going to hell anyway, and why not just free up some space? It's kind of like a corrupt file on your hard drive. If it doesn't work anymore, you just delete it. You don't try to save it.
In their theology, they're going to hell anyway.
Exactly.
Okay, but then they're leaving no room for their own theology where someone can be born again.
Have you ever talked to some of these people?
Yes, I have. I was one of these people years ago.
For the love of God, more rigid individuals I have not met.
That, and very often they use all of these things for their own gain, their own. I hate to say it, these people usually are extremely self-centered. They're not like Christ. They're not like Jesus. They're not selfless.
But when we're talking about a Christian and retributive justice, those two to me seem to be incongruent.
Well, the view that what you shared about pro-life, I really believe that should be quite revealing to somebody, to people.
It should be, but it's not.
Because pro-life should be pro-life. And that Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, Jesus was pro-life. I mean,
Pope John Paul had the same point of view, incidentally. He was anti-abortion, and he was anti-death penalty. And it's amazing the things that I've read from the evangelicals, just absolutely ripping him a new one over the fact that he was anti-death penalty. They could accept that he was pro-life on with respect to abortion, but getting into the anti-death penalty thing, it's like, oh, that he's the mark of the beast.
That's because they're claiming that pro-life or anti-abortion is protecting the innocent, while being against a death penalty is protecting the guilty.
How can you be protecting the innocent if we're all born of sin?
Good question. You mean that original sin thing again? Yeah,
So what the hell difference does it make?
Exactly.
No. I understand that. But their rationale is that they're seeing innocence and they're seeing corruption. So we'll kill somebody on this end, but not on this end.
How many children have been aborted since 1975 in this country?
It's huge.
Just give me a rough
figure. Into the tens of millions. Off the top of my head, I don't know the exact figure.
But it's in many millions?
The tens of millions.
Okay, hold that thought.
Something like around 50 or so.
Hold that thought. How many people have been killed by execution in our country since 1975?
In our country, I think we're probably right. It'd be right. It might be 1976, starting with Gary Gilmore after the moratorium was listed. I think it's right around 2,000 or so.
It's under that. It's under 1,500. Now, take the comparison between the two. On one hand, you have people who willfully commit crimes, do heinous acts.
Sure.
And they've become a danger to society. Now, aborted babies never had a chance to do anything, good or bad.
Granted.
And millions have been killed.
Tens of millions.
Okay. That's all I want to say about that.
That's all you want to say.
That's all you have to say about
Now,
that.
now what I want to say about original sin, so that the public becomes aware of what it is, it's a misinformation.
It's a fabrication.
It's misinformation. It's they don't understand the connection. They call it original sin because of the way the vernacular is used in the New Testament and the Old Testament. A child is born into sin. Well, the mistake here is that if you look at how our creation was made, science may shake their head at this, but it was subjected to frustration. In other words, it will go to a certain point of movement and then decay. There's always going to be decay. And so what the church is taught, sadly, is that because of Adam's sin, that now sin entered the world and decay entered the world. In other words, prior to Adam's sin, there was no death. And that's what they think. But the problem is that
It was a good time for fleas
if
flies.
and watch this. Adam and Eve were created, it says, by God. The vernacular is actually Elohim, which can be used as a plurality form or an ambassadorial agency. In other words, it could have been a celestial being that created Adam and Eve. Adam just means the earth. So there was an experiment, we know, in which they were put into a particular area, not a cage, but a fenced-off area from the rest of the world and well protected. And the difference is they were constructed by the hand of, quote, God. Their first child was who?
Cain.
And where was he born? In or outside of that garden?
Well, one
In
would
or
presume
outside of the
it would
garden?
be outside the garden.
It was outside the garden. It was afterwards that when they were expelled from that experimental
But
situation.
was he conceived in the garden?
Now watch this.
Did they commit sin
No,
in
this
the
is,
garden?
This is where it's really critical. This is where people have totally dropped the ball. I would say all churches, including the Protestant and Catholic Church at large, and every other offshoot messed up here. And that is that Cain and both Abel were born into corruption. They were born in the world. And what we did, well, not we, but what church
Orthodoxy.
what every church did, was they translated the word as sin in the sense of personal corruption. In other words, they said through Adam's seed,
Yeah.
Cain was born and original sin was within him. So he's a sinner by birth.
So it was passed on like a fungus.
And that's not what it means. It means they were born outside of Eden into corruption. In other words, that just means this, is that every human born from the loins of any human outside of the garden, not made specifically by the hand of Elohim, was created, fabricated, put together genetically in corruption. In other words, the body would die.
Will decay.
Will decay. It's not a bad thing or a good thing. It's not a moral situation.
It's just
No,
a
as
fact.
I illustrated in my commentary, if there was no death prior to the fall, the quote-unquote fall, we would be hip deep in fleas by now.
Right. So what happened is the church latched on to this vernacular that was translated from the Latin into the King James, and then offshoots thereof, and they go back to the supposed original Greek, but they're thinking with a lens already conceived, and that is the idea of original
You
sin.
presume they're thinking.
Is simply this, is that is everything born into this world is born into corruption, and it's not a moral dilemma at all. It says the whole creation groans like a woman in childbirth, eagerly awaiting the adoption of the Ben Elohim, the sons of God. And there's a purpose and a reason behind that. Paul says when we leave this body and this husk is left behind, we are changed. We're totally different. We're a new being. Our body will be totally different than it is today. It won't be in corruption. It will be spiritual. And so anyone who uses the idea of original sin in an argument is completely off base for any reason. No little baby's born into sin in the sense of morality or Adam's, quote, sin of a moral fall. They're born into corruption because they're outside the garden and they're exposed to this world of that's fallen.
So, if I were to cut to the chase here,
Yes, Chase?
it would be
No pun intended.
God bless America. It would be that you are making an axiomatic statement based upon the logistics of the situation as opposed to a moral observation as been interpreted.
It's not a moral it's not a moral position at all.
So the whole purpose of retributive justice is based upon a flawed premise.
It is. The first Adam, we came through that seed. The seed was born into the corruption of the environment itself. Sure. Anything born into the physical body will decay and die. That's the way it is. Okay?
I would contend that's the way it has to be in this temporal plane.
Right. We were never meant to be physical beings for eternity.
No.
Okay, so it's not a moral dilemma at all. Jesus is called the second Adam because he's born from where? Above. Mm-hmm. As we are born from above when we are born again. So again, it's not a situation in which it's a moral dilemma. People keep taking the moral, I guess you take ball and chain and shackling themselves to this ball and chain, saying it's a moral dilemma. I need to be freed from my sin. Yes, we all miss the mark.
Well, Mark,
but yeah.
Speaking of moral dilemmas,
Mm-hmm.
you asked a question about how many death penalties have been enforced.
How many people have been fried,
gassed,
gassed,
versus abortion,
smashed, etc.
According to the Death Penalty Information Center, since 1976, the United States has had 1,407 people executed.
Yeah, so it's under 1,500, right?
According to LifeNews.com, since 1973, Roe versus Wade, we have had 56,662,169 abortions.
And that are recorded.
That's that are
I
known.
wonder how many are done privately and not recorded.
Oh, I'm sure there's tons.
There's many.
Oh.
And how many take the pills?
I think there's an important thing.
There's no way to track
showing up here.
The morning after pill. That's one of the things my wife has to deal with at the center. Is that in compiling statistics, there's absolutely zero way to determine.
So when you take a look at, we just showed the difference between executions and abortions. And a lot of people will come up in arms against that, but the executions are very, very small for a country of 365 million people over a span of how many years?
Granted,
40 years?
The point from a legal
what's
and
the
rational...
difference between 1 and 1 million?
That's a good point, but I'm saying it's not
the death
like...
of one is a tragedy. The death of a million is a statistic. That's Joseph Stalin.
Well, it goes into what a comedian Eddie Izzard once
And I
said.
don't do a very good Russian accent.
And
so
that
sorry.
is, when somebody kills somebody, we kind of, we need to kill you. But when you start getting up into 25, 50, it's, we just kind of need to lock you in a rubber room. But when you start getting up into the millions, it's, damn, you must have a real busy appointment calendar. What do? Get up in the morning, death, 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 lunch, death, 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 death.
Yeah.
Well, I think all this goes back to, again, what Mark described about original sin really puts a different spin on our lives, who we are, why we're alive, and I think
and it really kills Orthodox Christianity.
The concept of original sin has perverted Christianity
it's
more than anything I can think of.
It's a cancer that you apply to little babies.
It's a cancer, and it's a sentence of death, is what it is. And
ergo, why you can allow somebody to be fried.
Exactly.
Why George Bush could mockingly. This is
exactly what I'm
George
saying.
Bush thinks he can mock. Oh, let me in the room with this guy. Holy hell.
We, as a population, don't understand life. We don't understand who we are. We don't understand what we're here for. We don't understand who we belong to.
What are we doing as evangelicals that we can make a born-again Christian out of an ex-alcoholic, George W. Bush, where he could look upon the life of another human being with such callous indifference?
Not just another human being, but a sister in the Lord.
Sister in the Lord. Yes, exactly.
Well, again, it goes right back to what I'm saying. He didn't understand, or
I think he understood.
You say he understood.
He understood
but I don't
fully.
think so because
he understood fully. It was nothing but a political
he had
view.
is from orthodoxy.
He understood this. He was running for the presidency in less than 2 years.
Let's look at it this way. If if a child follows their father and they believe in their father, they're going to do what their father does, and they're going to think it's a good thing. A lot of people look at God through the lens of the Old Covenant. Now, we just learned in a period of 40 years, there's been less than 1,500 executions in the United States of America. In one moment, when Moses came down from Sinai and saw the people had made a golden calf and were worshiping the golden calf, it says, Elohim, the angel, opened up the ground, and 3,000 souls went down to Sheol alive.
Yes, but that was God showing that he was long-suffering.
Wait a second. That's twice as many in one moment in time as happened in the United States in a matter of 40 years.
I
now,
get that.
if you say you follow your father, then what are you doing wrong? If George Bush says he's a born-again Christian, and it states right in the scriptures that capital punishment is a viable and necessary option.
That's why I use those quotes from Jesus, the Christ,
my point
the Messiah, who claimed to be God Almighty.
My point is that
they don't get it.
You cannot differentiate between the scriptures based on personal opinion. If you look at the idea of being a Christian or a Jew or even a Muslim, and you go to your scriptures, and it says that this person or this type of person is to be killed for this or killed for that, and you follow it, you think you're doing the right thing. So George Bush, it's a matter of ignorance as opposed to willful
because
decision.
Of the doctrines that he understands in Orthodoxy.
Especially in Texas.
What we understand.
You know, Texas,
them Texas Christians,
out of
they're
that,
just
out
off
of
the
that
wall.
figure I gave you of just over 1,400, more than 1/3 were from Texas.
Oh yeah, Texas
Over
and Florida.
500.
Texas and Florida are the two most executing states.
If we're going to get into all about Texas, understand that Texas is the only state in the union that you have the right to use lethal force to protect property.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
In other words, if someone is trying to steal your car because it's sitting in your driveway and you're sleeping in your nice warm bed, you have the right to get out and shoot him or her, blow their brains out because they're trying to take your horse.
That's what I was going to say, because they're a horse thief. They're a cattle rustler.
Texas is a different country within the United States. It's big enough as a country.
Well, no,
but
Texas
they
is bigger than most countries.
They were a hardy people. They had to deal with a lot of garbage for years. They had to be a self-preserving people.
What do you mean? They fought the entire nation of Mexico by themselves.
Right.
And
so
won.
I understand why their laws are different than someone who might live in Portland, Oregon.
Well,
for the love of God, Portland, Oregon ought to be a separate country, and then cut it away from the United States and slip it into
They
the
have
ocean.
no idea.
Separate world.
More.
It's a separate
granola
world.
crunch.
It's a separate,
There's not a more schizophrenic city in this nation.
But our problem isn't with George Bush and his reluctance to do a specific act of clemency.
Reluctance. Why are you soft soaping this?
Because I have to. Because if he's
he
fundamental,
was running for the presidency.
It doesn't matter.
He
and
wasn't being reluctant in the least bit.
His
He was
voting
selling
bloc
a
was
political
largely Christian evangelicals. And if he'd have stood up and pardoned Carla Faye Tucker, you know what would have happened? First, the Texans would have come after him with knives, and then the rest of the Christian evangelicals would have said, "You are of Satan. You're just like your father. Get out."
That's all he
wouldn't
knows.
have won anything, not even dog catcher.
I'm sorry. That's the way it's projected out
And
there.
then Al Gore would have been president. We'd all be dead.
My point is that we try and put the blame on a particular person, but he's wired a certain way in thinking and theology. Most people out there that are Christians are wired a certain way through their pulpits. That's changing in America.
I'm talking about just basic human consciousness.
Human nature.
He was a raging alcoholic in the 70s, okay? He was caught driving drunk once, okay?
Well,
for comparison, I will confess to this.
Quite
Back
interesting.
also in the 70s, there were 2 occasions where I drove drunk. Sorry, I admit to it. I was 16 years old. Both of those times, I don't remember the drive home. I could have wiped out a person, an entire family on those trips, okay? By the grace of God, I did not. But it stopped me from drinking. And like I often like to tell people, I stopped drinking before I was 21 because it's the truth. And it was in large measure because of stuff like that.
But we can't hold him accountable.
Now, I can. What do you mean we can't hold him accountable?
You mean he's not accountable for his own actions?
No, he'll be judged by our Father in heaven, and that's between him and our Father. We cannot hold him accountable.
As a Christian, I understand that Carla Faye Tucker is far better off now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, but that's not the point. The point is that we're supposed to be a light to one another. What kind of light
So you're going to
did
force
the
him to be a
President
light?
of the United States show to his fellow evangelicals except that, you know what, kick them when they're down?
President Obama says he's a Christian.
Oh, President Obama is a Muslim, and I can tell you, I can prove
my
to you
point-
that he's a Muslim
But
easily.
he also will stand before our Father with his own life.
Not long.
He sure has accomplished a lot more than I have.
Yeah, you. I have a
How
point,
long does it
and
take
then I
God to
lost
turn
it.
somebody into a pile of ash?
I don't know,
not
but
like
I'm going to
that.
find out.
Like an ant under a magnifying glass.
Well, where are we going with this? I mean,
Where are we going?
Hell in
with
a
this?
handbasket. Hell in a handbasket, my friend.
I think that we keep, I keep hearing an argument, and what it boils down to what we've said already over and over. It just keeps boiling down to that you have a person that you're talking about Bush, and he does this, and it's wrong. Okay, there is accountability legally in this physical realm. You do certain things, not only in the physical realm, it goes to our government, it goes to the policies and stores, companies, whatever. There is accountability. So there is accountability. But there's also a relationship with God. So there's two separate things here to
Sure,
me.
I get that.
And so on one hand, I hear you saying, because I actually hear out of you almost a contradiction of your position, although I know that you aren't really contradicting your position.
No, I don't believe I am. I'm vocalizing frustration.
But the reason,
over the
reason,
rapid ignorance.
the reason it comes to that is because there is accountability in this physical realm, in this world, whether it be laws, companies.
I get that.
And the accountability in the sight of God boils down to relationship. To me anyway.
I don't disagree with that.
Right. So it's very difficult for me to put anybody else to death when I know me. And I know not only that, though, more so, I know his love for me. I know what he's done for me. I know how he's set me free. He has set us free from this eternal punishment because of who we are. This all has to go back to who are we?
Well, and that's the question. And who are we? Who are we as Christians? What has the evangelical Christian church become, or morphed into, or been since its inception?
We already exposed that their basis of sin, the idea of sin and corruption, they're confused. They come from a point of view that is incorrect, based on what we believe.
One of the big problems
What we
that
believe is the truth.
my wife encounters at the center is in church support, and that is there are too many within the Christian church who will not support the center. The center is a crisis pregnancy center for those listening in, which I hope there are many. The churches are reluctant to support a crisis pregnancy center such as this because they see such a center as exacerbating a situation which is essentially self-correcting. And by that I mean that most of the people that the center caters to are of lower income, unmarried, etc. And these are people who will give birth to children who, if they aren't aborted, church looks upon as most likely being raised as thugs who will jack them up in a parking lot, in 12 or 13 years, steal their money. And, in 14, 15 years are raping their daughters or themselves. And so the center is looked upon as feeding
How do
a
you rape
fungus.
yourself?
You know what I mean. And so the situation is that there is this culture of death which hangs over the evangelical community, and they're perfectly fine with that. It goes back to that old saying that everybody's equal, but some people are a little more equal than others.
Well, tends to be the truth of our justice system at the moment.
Well, it's the truth
Well,
of
but
religion,
it's
too.
the truth exactly within religion.
Right.
But it's wrong.
Well, there's us, and then there's the clergy. Oftentimes.
Well, and, you know,
and we know, those of us that are in this room know who I'm talking about. You know, there are certain people that have better dispensations than us.
Well,
others.
yeah. And I'm going to simplify this. If we belong to our Heavenly Father, you belong to our Heavenly Father, and I
I know the jury might still be out on that.
And I need to kill you for some reason, you know, whatever.
Allah Akbar!
Yeah.
Maybe.
Who am I really violating?
Well, let's not kid ourselves. You'd be violating me in a big way.
Yeah.
And I may take umbrage with you. And as they say, if you're going to kill the king, you better do it on the first try.
Well, you know,
better succeed.
I know all that old stuff.
You know,
but what I'm saying is that ultimately your Father is going to be there for you.
He will be disgruntled, there's no doubt.
And he's going to be there for the one...
Mildly disgruntled.
Okay, so one of the things that we keep describing, what I see in it again, is something that, you know, I heard from you years ago that really made an impact on me. And that is that, maybe not even years ago, it was probably more recent than that, but is that we as humans in this world, if you look around the debase of girls getting pregnant because, you know,
because sex is natural?
What it boils down to is immaturity, selfishness, and the thing that made a great impact on me is that you described Jesus, and I knew this before, but Jesus is selfless.
Yeah.
We are in this physical realm learning to be selfless, and so we look at the church who are on a wrong foundation, and we look at the world and people that are all coming from this place of very selfish, very self-centered. I was taught at one time that it was a self-God scenario, that everyone kind of they're the god of their own life.
Right now, you got about half the evangelical church's ears smoking because they don't understand how they are being selfish versus selfless.
They know. That's why I call it a religion of meism.
Well, it is. That's what it is. But that's where we come from. That's the base. That's the beginnings of us. I mean, in this realm, when we in this realm, you naturally, as a baby, cry to be hungry. You come from a position in this realm as a human being needing to be taken care of.
As a human being, salient point. As a human being,
exactly.
The operative word. As a human being, the flesh. What are we as Christians supposed to be?
We're supposed to be spiritual.
Born again into the Spirit.
We're supposed to
guided
be
by the Spirit.
But that is the spiritual and relational aspect of this is not seen. It's supposed to be seen in how we live, act, treat others. In this very instance that you're talking about, understand life, and instead, they don't get it.
No,
they
don't
get
it. Life is not sacrosanct. It is just not.
Well, you're talking about what's it all about, and you handled that pretty well. We are a spiritual being having a physical experience.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus said this world, this realm, is not his. He was clear about this. If it were so, different things would have happened.
Sure.
But he said he leaves us here in this realm, but it's for our own good.
Exactly.
It's going to be difficult. There are wolves out here. A lot of you are going to be killed. But this is not our world. This is not our realm. So if people can understand, the part of being born again is the awakening that spiritual relationship. So you comprehend what you are. You're not just a physical being who's out to get what they can get. Prisons are full of people trying to get what they can get. There's that selfish aspect. They're taught that they must provide for themselves. That's normal in the physical realm. But what we are is we're a spiritual being having a physical experience. And we have to be able to differentiate the two.
Yeah, not a physical being having a spiritual experience,
like,
which is what the church believes.
We're taught we're physical beings.
Don't understand this at all.
No. Churches teach you're a physical being, and someday you'll be a spiritual being.
Maybe
if you're
well, in heaven, maybe.
But the truth
in hell,
is,
for sure.
We are a spiritual being, and we are having a physical experience. So, in regards to that woman who was killed, you take a Charles Manson who's been alive for I don't know how many years since.
I believe he's 83 now.
Right, and he's lived his life in prison. Well, a terrible life he's had.
He never killed anybody.
Yeah, he just directed it.
No,
But and this woman, you look at it and say, well, George Bush could have given her clemency, but the truth is that she's a spiritual being in the physical realm. And she went back home.
I understand that.
And
So
the
did
truth,
she.
The truth is, George Bush said it'll behoove my physical being
Right.
to have
Selfish.
her removed.
Exactly.
It will
That's right.
benefit me if she is killed.
That is what
he did
political
not reflect the
expediency
light
is.
of Jesus, the love of Jesus,
No, he didn't
the
understand
grace
it.
of Jesus, and he doesn't. And why doesn't he? Because of the church.
I knew before he was
Because of
president
orthodoxy.
that he was going to be a bad president,
Well,
and he did not disappoint.
Well, I didn't have a clue until afterwards, but the reality of it is, I see him
Oh,
as
I
a
watched that whole case with horror.
globalist, as introducing, the Patriot Act, all those things, and the 9/11 thing, whatever. Yeah, I know now that he's a man that's got an agenda and very selfish, but he's
He's
not
an
the only-
In
elitist.
every case, all those people, even Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler, all those people believed they were physical beings, either with no spiritual end or future, or a physical being with a spiritual future. They all got it backwards. Consequently, they became the rulers and did some very dastardly things to humanity. When you understand that you're a spiritual being, and this is not the eternity, this is simply a place and point in time for us to learn, to love, to help, to grow, then we learn
And
why
to
we're here. We understand.
and reflect our Father's heart.
Right.
Take
So,
on
what
his
is
nature.
it we should be doing as lights to our fellow man, lights of God, the face of God to our fellow man, to bust them out of this culture of death?
Well,
Because I'd really like to
when
know.
Jesus said,
I wish I knew how to do it other than what we do.
we have a problem with it. We call it the Great Commission in Matthew, where we're told to go out in the world and preach the gospel, teaching them today all that I commanded you. And, then we add in the baptize in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so we get this formula, which means we go out and we teach them Romans roads.
Does it have bullet points?
It really does. You basically tell them that, your dilemma.
Well,
You're
I
a
mean,
sinner.
that's if you see the Great Commission as actually canonical, because in my opinion, the Great Commission, there's multiple things that point in it that Matthew didn't actually write it. So, in my humble opinion, the Great Commission could be seen as something that could be shoved aside to where it wasn't necessarily needed. We can use it and we can make it as a point to evangelize, but at the same time, we can basically see it as non-canonical.
Well,
Levi wrote it.
Yes.
Well, who wrote it?
Levi.
Well, and let's look.
We're screwing with people who don't know anything. Right?
And let's look at it a little differently. What if you change the whole lens that we look at even the Great Commission? Once you change the original sin and you understand how that's messed up, you understand the foundation, and then you look at the commission. What is the Great Commission about? The good news. What's the good news? The good news is that Jesus was rose from the dead, that we have a relationship with him. He set us free from the powers and principalities of darkness.
Right, that was the point I was getting to when I talked about the Great Commission, is that we have a misunderstanding of what it is and what Jesus was telling us to do. What Jesus asked us to do was go out in the world and preach the good news. And no matter how you look at that, what good news? What is the good news? The good news was, at that particular juncture, that he died on our behalf, freed us from the tyranny of celestial beings that had contractual governing powers over us. This might sound all eerie and weird.
Most people aren't going to agree,
not going to
especially
understand.
if they've
But
ever been to church once.
The point is that by him rising from the dead, he was the first fruits, which means, believe it or not, you will rise from the dead. He's saying that everyone Everyone will rise from the dead because we are all spiritual beings. There's not a question on that. So whether you say you're going to a hellish experience or a heavenly experience, you have to be eternal. You're going to rise from this
Which do you
body.
get to first, though? Because on hell, you're going on a rocket sled, which can go pretty quick.
Well,
I'm in a
except
handbasket.
for-
You're on the rocket sled.
Except for here's the thing. It also tells us that he saved us from the works of the devil, which is death. And you and I know, we connect that the death of the old covenant is not our father's doing.
Then why are we dragging? Why in 2015 is a liberally leaning United States Supreme Court so inculcated with this culture of death?
Because they don't understand
It
where
really
the
is an
death
ignorance.
come from. They
It's
don't.
partially that we like to play God. We
Yes.
like to decide
So God-
we like to say who gets to live and who doesn't.
God
Power.
creates.
Give him hell, Wally, give him
God
hell.
creates.
That's right.
The
Power.
incompetent,
Authority.
the stupid, the ineffectual, the troglodytic individuals. They're the ones that kill.
Every human, the moment they leave their body, is going to understand far more than they know now, and they're going to realize that all they fought for, all their energies went towards, most often was selfish pursuit.
Well, I
So
understand
you
that.
mean they're
but-
going to have that Magneto Professor X moment where they realize in the alternate universe that all this time they've been fighting each other instead of fighting against a common enemy, they screwed up.
Yes.
Yeah, most people are going to understand. They're going to judge themselves. Actually,
Right.
The judgment. They're going to realize standing in, I guess, in the presence of what we would call God.
And there's another point to this, and you brought this up a little bit ago. Then what should we be doing? I think we need to somehow share this information. Not that we change people, but if we share the information, all this stuff, that's what we're doing here.
What I want to see personally, what I want to see are churches collapsing to their knees in weeping sorrow over the small-mindedness that they've carried with them for so long. I want shame to descend upon them like a ton of bricks so that they can be broken free of the shackles that orthodoxy has chained them to.
You might be reaching in pretty deep there, Chase.
So you want to be the
And
Holy Spirit,
then
convict
I want to
them.
go on a Caribbean cruise.
And
Yeah,
you want
I'd like
so
a
you
couple
want to be
$1
the
million
Holy
to rain
Spirit.
down out of the sky too while you're at it.
You want
Doesn't
to be
work
the
that
Holy
way.
Spirit and convict them.
Yes, yes.
We can't. We're not the Holy Spirit.
I understand that.
The
but
Spirit of God convicts each and every one. No, I see your position, and I
I
agree.
remember that interview that Bush had with Tucker Carlson.
Do I want them to
remember the
change?
little sneer
Do
on
I
his
want
face.
them to change? Of course I do. I
So
grew
what do you
up. I
learn?
spent 30-some years in the church, and I have no credibility because they couldn't answer one of my questions.
I learned that the 2000 election was a very difficult one for me because we had two lemons.
No, it's part of your learning experience. And I hope in the same situation you would choose a different route. But you can't condemn him from doing what he thought was right. Everyone's going to.
Here you go again.
You
This
can't.
is what I want to explode.
Guess what,
Do you
George?
think he was doing what he thought was right? No.
Every human
You know
stands
what?
before God on their own.
Richard Davis thought he was doing right by murdering and raping Polly Klaas.
And he will stand before God on his
But
own.
he thought he was
Hold
doing
on.
right.
But it doesn't. Just because he thought, I think maybe you're reading too much into that concept.
No, I
It just
don't.
be-
I agree with
because just because they thought they were right doesn't make them right.
No,
The
it doesn't
church-
make him right.
The church thinks they're right.
Richard Davis raped and murdered Polly Klaas because he was selfish. He wanted to get his rocks off with a
I
little girl,
totally
and then he didn't
agree.
want any witnesses. George Bush killed Carla Faye Tucker by not intervening when he well could have, because he wanted to be president. Both people died because of other people's selfish motives. End of story. Period. Thank you very much.
I agree. And this except
Twisted
for
logic.
Except for this goes back to, again, we have consequences in this realm which they're going to have to deal with.
Consequences like he could have hit somebody when he was driving drunk the multitude of times.
And
he
then
did
we
so.
have relationship with
Blinding,
our Father in this
stumbling,
realm.
drunk.
And see, it's these two things that are colliding here in this concept. But anyway,
All we can do is we can look at our life and we can try and assess from a scriptural, from a relational standpoint with our Father, and comport ourselves in the best way possible, knowing full well that we're going to get really dirty before we get out of here. We're going to make mistakes. And we can't really condemn other people, because I've been there
But
myself.
God demands perfection. If we get dirty and He demands perfection, we're screwed.
No.
I will admit one thing to you. I hold those who claim Christ to a higher standard than those who do not.
As well we should.
For a reason. And the reason being is because they are professing to be part of a relationship with their Father, and when they therefore exemplify behavior which is counter to that, and do so habitually, it irks me. I understand that people make mistakes.
It irks me too.
Mocking the woman, mocking the life of a person who's about to die.
Have you grown in the past 10 years?
I have grown.
Has anybody in the room not
Some people
grown?
think that I've grown more bitter, but that's a different
No,
story.
have we not learned more? You know, we're not the same people we were 10 years ago.
That's for
What
sure.
the hell does that have to
it
do
has
with
everything to do with it.
Okay, so back then when he was running for the presidency of the United States, when he was in the second term as a governor in the state of Texas, he was immature.
And He said this
Well,
will
of course
political.
I
he
know of a
was,
man that was in his 70s when he totally changed, and his heart was broken, and he loved people. You know, we all read about Ebenezer Scrooge.
Wait a minute. Shouldn't the guys on death row have that same opportunity?
They all do.
What about Ebenezer Scrooge? I'm
to
not
live
familiar
until
with
their
the story.
70s and 80s to have the opportunity to
Yes,
change who
yes,
they are?
that's our
Shouldn't
point.
they have the same opportunity? Or do we as society say, you know what, you're a screwed up individual, we're just going to erase you?
Well, here,
Well,
as
if we're
a-
going to
okay, let's
do
look-
that, then we shouldn't let them live until they're 70 or 80. We're
let's
just
look at the hard
wasting money
facts.
then.
Okay. There's been only 1,400 executions in all these years.
In the
40
United
years.
States.
United
I haven't
States.
gotten into other countries.
Okay. In the United States, different countries, they don't keep track in a lot of places. But okay, let's take a
They
look.
can't keep track.
You got people out there that have murdered somebody, and you're on death row because it was a type of killing in which you premeditated. Okay, it wasn't an, oops, I dropped my anvil on someone's head. It's a premeditated murder, and many times these are really heinous acts.
Many times they are.
And also in conjunction with that, many times these people will go out and do it again. Okay, so you've got to corral them from society.
Right.
So
Protect
society has to
people.
pay for that protection by keeping them in a cell and taking care of all of their bennies, the benefits, and so forth.
Well,
And-
basic life.
Well, not the basic life. A lot of them in prison live at a
Well-
higher standard than a lot of people in the United States of
the
America.
celebrity prisons do.
Well, I'm talking about with the medical benefits, the dental benefits, the eye benefits, the hospital.
You're familiar with Richard Speck, correct?
I don't know Richard Speck.
Richard Speck was famous back in the 60s for murdering 8 nurses. Ended up doing some time. He wasn't sentenced to death, incidentally. He was in Illinois, I believe. And he later was getting paid for estrogen treatment to become a woman
Okay.
in prison.
Well,
No death penalty.
that's
8 nurses. Cold-blooded murder.
okay. So you've got these people. You've
Yeah,
isolated
that's-
them.
that's- there's a problem there. In the
and you-
Is there a
system.
problem?
Yeah,
There's
you-
a
Equal
problem.
justice under the
There's
law.
a problem.
I kill 8 nurses. I get to grow breasts on your dime. You killed 2 people because you had a screwed up childhood and you're stealing motorcycle parts. Not needles for
Well,
you.
let's
buddy.
stick with this for a minute. And what I'm saying about this is that you've got to isolate these people so they won't do it again. Is there punishment for a crime? Okay, in our Constitution, in our laws, yes, you steal at work, you're going to get fired. I mean, that's just the way things are. Unless the guy, says, "Okay, we'll try you again." But if you keep stealing, you're out of there. Okay, so the point is, you've incarcerated these people, and now what do you do with them? Do you keep them incarcerated for the rest of their lives?
Yeah.
No,
Just
we
for the-
lock them up in vacuum chambers.
Right. So what happens is at a cost of $40,000 a year per prisoner. Somewhere wasn't the high.
Where are you
30s.
getting your figures from?
That's when I was up
it's a
doing
little
prison
higher
ministry in
now.
Shelton. It's probably up
think-
around 40.
Wally, don't you have these figures?
think it's
The
Yeah, I got them right here.
Figures
It's about
for
70.
death row
Death row's
inmates
around 90.
are hellaciously high.
Yeah.
Far more so than the general prison
Well,
population.
My point is that even a normal population, what's normal population per year?
Well, it hasn't got
As
there
Google
yet.
is our friend, we'll be
Okay.
give you that
Well, the
information.
point is you've got I don't know how many million are incarcerated in the United States of America at this point. What's it, like 3 million, or
It's roughly in that neighborhood.
might be even higher than that?
But but it's revolving. So you have
You still got the cost.
You have the initial incarceration number, but then you've got 3 times or 10 times as many on paper after
So,
the fact.
if I could just interject here, you were asking about the money figures. From deathpenaltyinfo.org, it says, cases without the death penalty cost $740,000, while cases where the death penalty is sought cost $1.26 million. Maintaining each death row prisoner costs taxpayers $90,000 more per year than a prisoner in the general population. And there are 714 inmates in California right now that are on death row.
Yes.
So okay, so you look. It's a hellacious cost.
Well, we'll use the technical term buttload.
Buttload of money. Okay, so you've got the prisoners that cost a lot of. So we get penalized. Normal citizens who don't do anything wrong get the double whammy. They've got a predator or someone out there doing evil, and you've got to incarcerate them. But at whose cost? It's always at the citizen's cost, who did nothing wrong.
Okay,
Well,
so
society always pays
is it
the
your
penalty.
contention, therefore, that it is most expedient to simply execute those who are found convicted of a capital crime immediately? Because
That's a
it
tough
reduces
question.
cost.
When you look at it from a fiscal standpoint, you're faced with a whole load of dilemmas and costs that are just enormous.
Here's the
I
situation.
would say yes. If we are that serious that we need that this person should be put to death because of their heinous crimes, they should be done as soon as possible.
Okay,
and
now-
not just by the state. I think that the people convicting them
All right,
should
now
have
hold
to
on,
press
hold
the
on for a
button.
moment. Let me counter that. The Innocence Project in and around the late 1990s, just in Illinois alone, found 17 of those on death row absolutely innocent through
Right.
DNA testing. It led George Ryan, then the governor, to declare the moratorium on capital punishment in 2000
Sure.
because he was astonished. But the criminal justice system in Illinois had become so corrupt that he could no longer be secure in the knowledge that those people on death row were in fact guilty.
Mm-hmm.
Now, added to the fact that the Innocence Project came up tremendous backlash and resistance from the prosecutors in the state of Illinois, from municipalities all the way up to the state government, because they didn't want any of these convictions overturned, because any conviction overturned blots the personal district attorney or prosecutor's
Sure.
record. So a person's life meant less than my getting a ding on my record as a prosecutor. It was an absolute outrage.
There we
and
go.
this is going on all over the United States.
Agreed.
And
Okay. And this is what Jay Inslee in Washington State found, the exact same situation. There was no equal justice. You have prosecutors in the age of DNA, okay, well, we can go on. Maury Povich's show is all about anymore just saying you are not the father or you are the father. DNA is cheap and it's simple and pretty damned accurate
Well, we're still at,
today.
I would say, the ground floor.
So,
and-
my point is
you
this.
can go to Walgreens and get Who's Your Daddy.
yeah,
kits.
we're still at the
So-
ground floor.
My point is this.
with,
A DNA
DNA.
test to confirm blood, semen, etc. at the scene of a crime used as evidence to exonerate an individual ought to be number one. And it is not, because prosecutors step up and go, absolutely not. A jury of his peers convicted him based upon my expert
Well,
prosecution.
that's going to all change.
Well, it's not changing
It's-
now. In the
it's-
meantime,
it is changing.
We are throwing people into the maw of death because a
it is
prosecutor
changing.
wants to protect his precious little
Forensic
record.
evidence.
Every prosecutor who has denied DNA testing and is later found to have hidden such testimony or evidence which led to somebody's death ought to get the death penalty.
Well, and
There you go. Because
and-
they are accessories to murder.
I would agree with that.
And a figure that I got from deathpenaltyinfo.org as well is that out of 86 death row cases, 86 innocent death row cases, 45 of them should have been found in it because of wrongful eyewitness
Oh, that's Legion.
Yeah.
You ever seen oh God help me.
Life with Eddie
My
Murphy?
Cousin Vinny.
Is it possible the two youths,
To what? What was that word?
what word?
To what?
What?
Did you say utes?
Yeah, two youths.
What is a ute?
Oh, excuse me, Your Honor. Two youths.
Yes.
That was a great movie.
Watch Life with Eddie Murphy.
I've watched all as well. But or Shawshank Redemption, same situation. But I like
So-
My Cousin Vinny. But we're gonna have to cut it there because we have run out of time for this episode. So for
Dave Cameron.
Mark Wilson.
Wally Rogers.
Lou Rogers.
I am Chase Rockwell saying so long until the next time you find yourself across the cosmos.
Send any questions or comments to us via email at info@acrossthecosmos.com. Also, visit us on the web at www.acrossthecosmos.com for show updates, news, and other important information. No part of this podcast may be used without the express written permission from the staff of Across the Cosmos. Across the Cosmos is a production of Omite Corporation. Copyright 2015.